Yes, Sidney. You sound happy, Sidney. Why should you be happy when I'm not?
Every day I drop a fresh video diving deep into the legends of Hollywood's golden age. If you love stories about the stars who built the Dream Factory, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, or leave a comment. It means the world and doesn't cost a thing. Thank you for tuning in. Now let's get into this wild story. Burt Lancaster hated Lee Marvin, and now we finally know why. I was just 23 when I saw something that completely flipped how I understood manhood forever. Picture this. Christmas Eve, 1965, Death Valley, California. The air finally cooling down to a brutal yet merciful 38 degrees Celsius. Most of the film crew had already disappeared to write letters home or fight over the one-half working payphone just to call their wives or girlfriends. But two men didn't leave, two of the biggest stars in Hollywood, and what went down between them that night would destroy their working relationship for good. Back then, I was just a camera assistant on a Western called The Professionals. My job was simple: load the film, stay quiet, stay unseen. But that night, staying invisible was impossible because what I saw had nothing to do with what people would later claim. It wasn't about alcohol, even though there was more than enough of that. It wasn't about professionalism, though that's the excuse they used. And it wasn't even about ego, even though both men had enough of that to fill the Mojave Desert. No, this was about something much deeper, something dangerous, something that digs straight into the question every American man of that era secretly feared. Are you the real deal, or are you just pretending? And here's what makes this story unforgettable. The man who asked that question, he wasn't wrong. By the time that night ended, Burt Lancaster, the man everyone called Hollywood's most disciplined actor, was forced to face a truth he'd been running from for 50 years. And Lee Marvin, the tough-as-nails war hero, showed that being authentic can turn into its own kind of trap. I'm jumping ahead. To really get that Christmas Eve blow-up, you've got to know who these men actually were beneath the lights and applause. Not the posters, not the personas, the real guys under the armor. And trust me, neither was who you think. Act 1. The self-made warrior, Burt Lancaster. A walking performance of strength. Burt Lancaster was born November 2nd, 1913, in East Harlem, New York. Tough blocks, tight pockets, real grit. His dad worked the post office, steady but modest, and the family felt every dollar stretch. Young Burton Stephen Lancaster learned early that nothing falls in your lap, not in that neighborhood. If you couldn't fight, you faded. Simple as that. But Burt found something sharper than fists. His body was a machine that could fly. He could flip, tumble, and move like gravity was just a rumor, floating through air like he owned it. Picture him building a cathedral brick by brick. Only the cathedral was himself, crafted with control so precise it felt bulletproof by the time Hollywood came calling. By 1965, at 52, he was bigger than actor. He was a producer, a businessman, a straight-up power broker who sidestepped the studio leash by starting his own outfit. In a town where studios stamped names like property tags, Lancaster said, "No thanks," and walked his own lane with authority. Independence wasn't a slogan for him. It was policy. His routine was legendary and a little intense. 5 a.m. alarms, desert runs in brutal heat, and calisthenics that would fold men half his age. On set, he didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't drift. He followed the script of self-mastery like it was sacred law. The crew on The Professionals watched him with awe, but also with a quiet chill, because the discipline felt like steel you didn't dare test. This was a man who treated his body like a precision weapon, something that needed constant tuning just to stay sharp. He knew every line so well he could spit them out backward without missing a beat. He showed up on set exactly on time, not early, not late, because for him, precision wasn't just a habit, it was a creed. In a town built on chaos and wild indulgence, Burt Lancaster was the one man who refused to lose control. He was the Puritan at the party, the monk in the casino, a man who stood out because of his restraint, not his excess. And like anyone who builds themselves through pure force of will, he carried a quiet contempt for those who didn't. You could feel it in how he looked at people, not mean, but measuring. Yet, here's the thing the crew never realized. Maybe something even Burt himself didn't fully admit. All that discipline, that obsession with control. It wasn't strength alone. It was compensation for something. But for what exactly? We'll get there soon enough. Because first, you need to meet the man who tore that armor open, Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin was everything Burt Lancaster wasn't, and that right there was the problem. Born February 19th, 1924, in New York City, 11 years younger than Burt was, but in terms of life experience, Lee was from another world entirely. In 1942, at just 18, he enlisted in the Marines, not out of blind patriotism and not because he lacked choices. No, he did it because, as he put it, he wanted to find out what he was made of. And he found out the hard way. On Saipan, June 1944. The Battle of Saipan wasn't just another fight. It was one of the bloodiest nightmares in the Pacific. The Japanese soldiers knew they were doomed and were determined to drag as many Americans down with them as possible. In the middle of that chaos, Lee Marvin took a sniper's bullet, hit straight through his backside, tearing into his sciatic nerve. That wound would leave him scarred for life, but it also carved something raw and real into him, something that no Hollywood script could ever fake. He spent 13 long months stuck in naval hospitals, learning how to walk again and living with pain that never really left. He got the Purple Heart for his wounds, but that medal didn't tell the whole story, not even close. Yeah, Lee Marvin walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but the real scars were the ones nobody could see. If Burt Lancaster was a cathedral built piece by piece, Marvin was the wreck that survived the bombing. Cracked walls, bent beams, and a foundation that had shifted from too many hits. He was still standing, but you could see the fire he'd been through. And that kind of fire changes a man forever. By 1965, Marvin was riding high, fresh off winning the Academy Award for Cat Ballou. He wasn't Hollywood's idea of perfect. He was Hollywood's new definition of cool, raw, unpredictable, and real. When Lee Marvin played a tough guy, people didn't see acting. They saw truth, because for him, it wasn't performance. It was memory. And that bottle he always had nearby, it wasn't for fun. It was a fix. His version of medicine. When you've watched 19-year-old kids crying out for their mothers, when you've taken lives and still see their faces every time you close your eyes, whiskey stops being a drink. It becomes a shield, self-prescribed, self-dosed, and never really working, but it numbed the noise just enough to keep him going. On set, Marvin was a different kind of professional. He'd show up late sometimes, forget lines here and there, and yeah, he'd be drunk more often than not. But when that camera started rolling, something electric happened. The chaos flipped itself into focus. Suddenly, he became the moment. Pure, raw presence that couldn't be faked. The crew couldn't help it. They split into sides. Team Lancaster versus Team Marvin. Team Control versus Team Chaos. Team Performance versus Team Authenticity. But what nobody saw, not even the two men themselves, was that both sides had it wrong. This wasn't about order or destruction. It was about two men chained to different versions of what it meant to be strong. And soon, under that brutal Death Valley sun, 120 degrees, months of heat and tension, all that performance was about to burn away. Because when you throw two alpha legends into the fire, one built on discipline, the other forged in trauma, the act ends, and the truth finally begins. Act 2. The escalation, the first crack. The trouble kicked off in October during the first week of principal photography, and the location was absolutely merciless. Death Valley earned that name for a reason. The production picked it on purpose because the script called for Mexico in summer, a place where the heat wasn't just weather. It was a character with teeth. Tempers ran hot under that sun, beating down on red rock and endless sand, and every step felt like a test. Lancaster rolled in not with a personal car, but on the truck, the one piled with gear like a traveling circus of discipline. Parallel bars, weights, a full portable gym he set up in his hotel room like a man on a mission. While other actors checked out the local bar scene, Burt was doing handstand push-ups against the wall at 52 in Death Valley, just so his deltoids didn't lose a shred of definition during a 3-month shoot. Relentless doesn't even begin to cover it. Marvin showed up with suitcases, the plural, and the crew joked one was for clothes and 3 were for bottles, which wasn't exactly wrong. First morning, director Richard Brooks called a table red, and the contrast was wild. Lancaster arrived 15 minutes early, script marked in 3 different ink colors like a blueprint. Marvin strolled in 20 minutes late, script folded in his back pocket, working through what looked like a serious hangover. Total opposites colliding in slow motion. I remember this moment clear as day. Lancaster studied Marvin with a look I couldn't decode. Not angry. More like a scientist staring at an equation that breaks all the rules, yet still spits out the right answer. The read-through was smooth, but the styles clashed. Marvin, half awake by the look of it, delivered his lines with a natural vibe that made Lancaster's polished precision feel almost theatrical by comparison, like reality versus rehearsal. After they wrapped, I heard Lancaster talking to Brooks, and the words stuck. Is he going to show up like this every day? Brooks, who'd wrangled both difficult and brilliant actors, just smiled and said, Lee's Lee, but wait till you see what he does on camera. Lancaster didn't look sold. 3 weeks later, we were in Valley of Fire State Park, Nevada. Moved there for those wild rock formations, red cliffs so dramatic they looked like Mars had a baby with hell, and the ground rules were about to shift again. The scene that day was no joke. Lancaster and Marvin had to scale a cliff face while bullets flew around them, find cover, and fire back. It was an action sequence that demanded split-second timing, laser focus, and, above all, sobriety. November 12th, 1965. Call time, 6 a.m. The temperature at dawn was already a blistering 32 degrees and climbing fast. Lancaster showed up at 5:45, already in costume, already stretched, already rehearsed. He ran through the sequence with the stunt coordinator 3 times before Marvin even showed up. Then at 6:47, Marvin finally appeared, sunglasses on, moving carefully, deliberately, the way someone moves when they're trying to look steady. The plan was simple: climb together, Lancaster leading, Marvin following. They'd rehearsed it the day before. Easy, right? It should have taken 2 hours, max, but it dragged on for 9. The reason? Lee Marvin kept blanking on the choreography. Not the lines, those he nailed, but the physical routine, forget it. Grab this rock, plant the left foot here, pull up, wait for the blast, react, move. Simple directions that turned into chaos on repeat. From my camera position up on a ledge above them, I had a perfect view of both men, especially Lancaster. What I saw on his face wasn't anger, not yet. It was something simmering, frustration turning into something heavier, something personal. Years later, I finally understood what was really burning in him that day. Lancaster had spent his whole life proving one idea: that discipline could conquer anything, that self-control and effort could crush weakness, that a man could build himself into greatness. Every rep, every routine, every perfect frame of film was his proof that willpower could rewrite destiny. But then came Lee Marvin, drunk, reckless, stumbling his way through the scene, and somehow still mesmerizing, still magnetic on camera in a way that no amount of training could touch. He was raw truth standing next to crafted perfection, and the camera loved him for it. It was like watching a master calligrapher who'd spent 30 years perfecting every brushstroke suddenly watch a kid with a crayon scribble something that somehow felt alive. Lancaster wasn't just frustrated. He was watching the foundation of his entire philosophy start to crack right there on that scorching cliff face. The injustice of it all was eating him alive. By the time we wrapped that day, 3:47 p.m., with the desert sun turning everything into an open furnace, Lancaster didn't say a single word to Marvin. Not a glance, not a nod, nothing. He just walked right past him, jaw tight, every muscle in his body wound like wire. The whole crew felt it. We knew something was building, and it wasn't just heat stroke. By mid-December, 3 weeks out from Christmas, 3 weeks before everything blew up, the set was falling apart. The production was behind schedule. The terrain was brutal, and the heat had broken everyone's patience. Marvin's erratic behavior had them running 10 days late, and director Richard Brooks was catching serious heat from the studio. The crew was worn thin, snapping at small things, and that's when Lee Marvin made his biggest mistake. We were on lunch break, 45 minutes to grab a plate from the catering tent, find a scrap of shade, and pretend the desert wasn't slowly cooking us alive. Marvin, as usual, was surrounded by the stunt guys, his crew, the ones who loved his wild war stories and his daredevil attitude. He'd won their respect by doing his own stunts, even when it meant ignoring every safety rule Lancaster swore by. About 50 feet away, I saw Lancaster setting up his portable parallel bars, his daily workout ritual, even in that heat. And Marvin? He was drunk. Not sloppy drunk, but that dangerous kind of functional drunk. Loose enough to let the truth slip, confident enough to keep talking. He started riffing about Hollywood, actors, the difference between being real and just pretending. Then, laughing, he dropped the line that changed everything. You know what Burt Lancaster is? He's a circus performer who learned his lines. Talented, sure. Disciplined, absolutely. But real? Please. The man's been performing his whole life. He doesn't even know how not to perform. The stunt guys cracked up, and they thought it was harmless banter, just Marvin being Marvin. But Lancaster heard every word. From where I stood, I saw him freeze mid-pull-up, hanging there in total silence. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he lowered himself down, eyes locked straight ahead. The laughter kept rolling, but something in the air had shifted, heavy and electric, like the moment before a storm hits. He didn't confront Marvin that day, but not a word, not a glare, nothing. Just walked back to his trailer, shut the door, and locked himself in. Silence, that kind of silence that hums like a live wire. Later that night, the key grip came up to me and said quietly, "This isn't going to end well. Those two are going to have it out. Question is when." He was right. The answer? Christmas Eve, just 10 days away. And when it happened, it would uncover something neither man saw coming. Act 3, the confrontation, the setup. Christmas Eve, 1965. It fell on a Friday. The production gave most of the crew the next 3 days off. A bunch of folks flew back to L.A. to spend the holiday with their families, but not everyone could go. The principals, the main actors, the director, and the key crew stayed behind. Too expensive to fly everyone home and back for just a long weekend. So we ended up spending Christmas in Death Valley. The production team tried to make it festive, bless them. Someone had hung up a string of colored lights in the catering tent. There was a turkey on the table, and someone's beat-up cassette player was crackling out Bing Crosby. It was cheerful on the surface, but underneath it felt hollow. That sad kind of holiday cheer you only feel when you're stuck miles away from home in the middle of nowhere. By 8 p.m., most folks had eaten, swapped small gifts, and disappeared into their rooms to escape the cold. The desert turns eerie at night, not freezing, but cold enough to make the day's blazing heat feel like some fever dream. Still, a few stayed behind, clinging to the last bit of company they could find. The catering tent had been transformed into a makeshift bar. Someone had managed to score real whiskey, not the cheap stuff, but proper bourbon that burned smooth and almost tasted like civilization. And, of course, Lee Marvin was there, loud, laughing, holding court like he always did. And Burt Lancaster, naturally he wasn't there. No drinks, no distractions, just discipline. He was outside his trailer, a dark figure under the dim light, focused as always. From where I was sitting, loading film magazines for the next day's shoot, a job I'd volunteered for just to have a little peace and a bootleg beer, I could see him clearly. The way he moved, slow and rigid, like a man waiting for something he already knew was coming. He was out there grinding at 10:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve in 30-degree weather, cranking push-ups, sit-ups, and pull-ups on a bar he'd rigged between two support poles like a one-man boot camp. It was intense and kind of heartbreaking to watch, like someone bailing a sinking ship with a teaspoon. All that discipline, all that control, all that effort against what? Age, time, the big question of whether any of it even mattered. Then came the spark, 11:17 p.m. I checked my watch, thinking about calling it a night, when Marvin's voice ripped across the desert like a flare. Silence. Look at him. Look at him. The great Burt Lancaster shops on Christmas Eve. You know what that is? That's not discipline. That's fear. The words hung in the cold air like a dare. A couple voices from the tent tried to cool it down. "Lee, come on, man." But Marvin wasn't stopping. The bourbon had slipped the leash on whatever restraint he usually had. Fear of what someone asked, maybe genuinely curious, maybe trying to redirect. He was getting louder, like he wanted Lancaster to hear every syllable. Fear of being ordinary. Fear that if he stops performing for one damn second, everyone will see what he really is. And what's that? Another voice, a circus performer in a cowboy hat, a guy who learned how to flip and tumble and smile pretty and parlayed into a career playing men. The tent went quiet. You could feel the hit travel. He'll never be soldiers, warriors, real men. I've seen real warriors. Boys, 19 years old, 20 years old, dying in sand on Saipan, screaming for their mothers while they're in. Out real blood, real death, real sacrifice. His voice wobbled, the bravado slipping, raw truth cutting through the booze. And then Hollywood takes guys like Lancaster and me, and we put on costumes and pretend. The line landed like a hammer, and that's when the night truly turned. We play act trauma for money, but at least I know I'm pretending. At least I have the decency to be ashamed of it. Lancaster, he thinks he's earned it through discipline, through push-ups, like warfare is just another role you prepare for in a gym. The words hit like glass breaking in the dark. Sharp, ugly, impossible to ignore. Lancaster stepped into the edge of the light like a shadow turning solid, calm face, steady eyes, the kind of quiet that makes people sit up straight. I don't know how long he'd been standing there, but from that almost serene look, I'd bet he'd heard enough. He moved toward the tent, not fast, not slow. The walk of a man executing a plan with surgical focus. Inside, conversations died one by one, like candles snuffed out by a cold wind. Lancaster crossed the threshold and the whole tent went silent. Only Bing Crosby kept crooning about white Christmases like some eerie soundtrack to a showdown. Say it again, Lancaster said, voice low, even, almost casual. And that made it hit even harder. Marvin didn't flinch. Maybe bourbon, maybe exhaustion, maybe 20 years of PTSD and survivor's guilt finally locking onto a target. You heard me. I did, but I want to make sure everyone else hears it too. You think I'm a fraud? A circus performer playing dress-up? That about right? The words were clean, no stutter, no retreat, just truth thrown like a punch. Marvin stood up, swaying a little, but his eyes were clear, clearer than they'd been in weeks. You want the truth? Yeah, that's what I think. The air was tight enough to snap. Two versions of manhood squaring up under a string of holiday lights like it was a boxing ring. You spend your whole life controlling every single thing, your body, your career, your image, but you can't control the one thing that actually matters, which is you weren't there when it mattered. When the real test came World War II, you were stateside, entertaining troops, putting on shows while guys like me were dying in the Pacific. And now you play tough guys. You play soldiers and warriors and rough men. And you do it so perfectly with so much discipline that people believe it. But I know. The words landed heavy, no theatrics, just judgment that sliced through the tent like a blade. Because I was there and you weren't. That line cracked the air open like thunder. What happened next comes to me only in flashes. Lancaster's jaw tightening, that famous jaw that had clenched 1,000 times on camera to show controlled rage. But this time, it wasn't a performance. It was real. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from pure restraint. The brutal effort of holding himself back from doing what every instinct screamed for him to do. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, measured, and that made it even scarier than if he'd shouted. You're right about some of it, he said. I wasn't at Saipan. I didn't storm beaches. I didn't get shot. I didn't watch my friends die. I was in Italy. Special services, entertaining troops, putting on shows. Marvin blinked, thrown off balance. He'd been expecting denial, rage, anything but this calm admission. Lancaster stepped closer, his tone slicing like a blade hidden under silk. But let me tell you what I was doing while you were getting drunk on survivor's guilt and calling it authenticity. I was building, every damn day, building a body that wouldn't quit, building a craft that couldn't be ignored, building a career from absolutely nothing. You know where I came from, East Harlem. My father worked for the Postal Service. We had nothing, and I clawed my way up from circus tents and busted vaudeville acts playing to empty houses, where the only applause came from my own stubbornness. He took another step, voice rising with controlled fury, every word hitting like a hammer. And you know what I learned from all that? Discipline beats talent. Control beats chaos. Building yourself beats waiting for the world to forge you. The tent was so quiet you could hear the wind shift outside. Nobody dared breathe. So, yeah, he continued, locking eyes with Marvin. You went to war, you got shot, you earned a medal. Good for you. But what did you do with it? You turned it into an excuse to drink, an excuse to show up late, an excuse to treat every job like it's beneath you. And because you've seen real things, right? He leaned in, voice like ice now. Well, let me tell you something about real things. The air was thick with tension. Two men, two definitions of strength, colliding with years of pride, pain, and truth, hanging between them like a live fuse about to blow. This is real, Lancaster's voice cut through the tent, steady but burning with conviction. This work, this craft, this discipline, it's as real as anything on that beach. The difference between us, Lee, is that I built my strength. You got yours handed to you by a bullet, and you've been coasting on it ever since. The words hit like a gut punch, sharp and merciless. He stepped closer until Marvin had to tilt his head up slightly to meet his eyes. You'll never work with me again, Lancaster said, his tone calm but final, the kind of calm that ends things. After this film wraps, our professional relationship is over. Not because of tonight, but because I can't respect a man who mistakes trauma for achievement. Then he turned and walked out, silent, controlled, every movement precise, back toward his trailer under the dim desert light. For a moment, the tent was dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Then, finally, someone turned off the cassette player. Another voice, dry and tired, said, "Merry Christmas." It was the least merry sound I've ever heard. But here's what none of us understood that night. Not the crew, not Marvin, not even Lancaster. Both men had told the truth, and both men had lied. Act 4, The Revelation, What Nobody Knew. The film wrapped on January 14th, 1966. Lancaster and Marvin finished the shoot with strict professionalism. No blow-ups, no shouting, no small talk. They were never filmed in the same shot again. Director Richard Brooks had quietly rewritten the final sequence just to keep them apart. Funny thing, that distance, that tension, lit up the screen. When the professionals hit theaters, critics raved about the authentic masculine chemistry between the two stars, calling it raw, powerful, and real. They weren't wrong. The truth had burned through the fiction. The movie became a massive hit, a defining film of the decade. But behind the scenes, Lancaster and Marvin never spoke again. Not a single word, not even at award ceremonies or studio events. As for me, I left Hollywood in '68, got married, had kids, built a life far away from the bright lights and egos of that world. That night in Death Valley faded into just a story, a wild memory from a younger man's life. Sometimes at parties, I'd tell it for laughs. I once saw Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin almost come to blows on Christmas Eve. And for 58 years, that's all it was, a good story, till 2023. I was cleaning out my garage one dusty afternoon, sorting through the relics of a life half forgotten. Call sheets, production notes, faded photos. The leftovers of a kid who'd brushed against fame and thought it would last forever. Then, buried under it all, I found something that changed how I saw that night, and those men forever. At bottom of the box was a medical file, Lancaster's military file, stamped and official, sitting there like a secret waiting to explode. I don't even know how I ended up with it. Probably scooped it from the production office with a stack of other papers without thinking. But inside was his full World War II service record. And one detail flipped the whole story on its head. Burt Lancaster had tried to enlist in combat units again and again, 1942, 1943, twice in 1944, and every time he got rejected for flat feet. It was a circus injury from his acrobat days, minor enough for flips and stunts and all that physical grace, but serious enough for the military to stamp him 4F, not fit for combat, period. Picture that, the strongest man in Hollywood, the poster boy for discipline, barred from the war because of flat feet. Suddenly, sitting in my garage, 60 years later, I understood every push-up, every dawn run, every strict routine and carved muscle. It wasn't vanity at all, and it wasn't just discipline for pride's sake. It was penance. Penance for not being allowed to be the warrior he wanted to be, for running from a safe distance while other men shipped out, for living with the question that never let him sleep. If he'd been allowed to go, would he have measured up? And Lee Marvin, what about his drinking? It wasn't only PTSD, and it wasn't just survivor's guilt, heavy as that already is. It was the brutal knowledge that the worst thing that ever happened to him, the wound, the trauma, also became the best thing for his image because it gave him something no charm or talent could buy: unquestionable authenticity. It proved he was real, that his toughness wasn't performance, and that's its own nightmare, because what happens to your identity if you take that away? If he hadn't been shot, if he hadn't gone to war, would anyone have treated him like the real deal, or would he have been just another actor trying to sell a hard look on camera? Two men, both trapped, Lancaster locked out of the war that would have validated his strength, and Marvin chained to a wound that kept proving he was exactly who he said he was. Marvin was trapped too, trapped by having the war, by knowing his whole identity was built on something brutal and wondering if everything else about him was hollow. Both men hated each other for holding what they themselves could never have. And worse, they hated themselves for needing it at all. And here's the part that hits hardest. If you've watched this far, you're probably over 50, maybe over 60. You've lived some life. You've built, fought, endured, and maybe, just maybe, you've felt a flicker of this same question burning somewhere inside. Maybe you built yourself from the ground up, through willpower, through sweat, through an iron refusal to be ordinary. But deep down, you still wonder, does it count? Does self-made strength have the same weight as being battle-tested by life or loss? Or maybe you're on the other side. Maybe you've been through it. Something hard, something that scarred you deep. Trauma, grief, heartbreak, and you've carried it like proof that you survived. But even then, some quiet part of you asks, is that all I am? Am I nothing but my scars? It took me 60 years to understand this. The question itself is the trap. The second you start asking, am I real enough? Am I authentic enough? Have I earned the right to be who I am? You've already lost, because authenticity isn't something you win or prove. It's something you stop chasing, something you stop measuring. Burt Lancaster spent his life trying to prove he was real through discipline, like a man who learns to perfectly forge his own signature, flawless, technical, and empty of meaning. And Lee Marvin, he spent his life trying to prove his pain was worth something, like a man clutching a terrible trophy he never wanted in the first place. And they couldn't stop showing people the receipts, proof of their pain, proof of their power. Both men performing, both men imprisoned by their own myths. The tragedy wasn't that they hated each other. Hate is easy. Hate is clean. The real tragedy is that they were right to hate each other, because each one saw in the other the thing he feared most about himself. Lancaster looked at Marvin and saw a kind of raw authenticity he could never fake, no matter how many perfect takes he nailed. And Marvin looked at Lancaster and saw success built on something other than pain, which forced him to face the darkest thought of all. What if his suffering wasn't the price of greatness, but just suffering? And that's what both of them missed completely, the real truth. Closing, the resolution. You don't have to choose between discipline and authenticity. You don't have to be one or the other. Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin, the icons of the professionals, spent their lives trying to prove which mattered more, and in the end, both were wrong. Before you close this video, I want you to try something. Think about the person you've been hardest on. The one whose confidence, success, or strength has always rubbed you the wrong way. Ask yourself this: what do they have that scares me? What do they make me afraid I'll never achieve? Because that feeling isn't really about them. It's about you. It's about the story you've been quietly telling yourself about what makes you real. Lancaster and Marvin never figured that out. They carried that resentment all the way to their graves, but you don't have to. You can drop the performance, stop measuring your worth, and realize the truth. You've always been real. You don't have to earn it, prove it, or fight for it. You already are. Thanks for watching. If this story hits something in you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below to keep these forgotten Hollywood stories alive.